Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I'll be covering important Dispels, Purges, and Soothes in Shadowlands Mythic Plus dungeons. Similar to my Interrupt video, which you can find linked below or on my channel, I'll be going through each dungeon and highlighting all of the important effects that exist, which will hopefully make your dungeon runs a little bit smoother. Hopefully this video helps not only healers, but also DPS specs that have access to things like Dispels or Spell Steal to learn a bit more about dangerous mobs and dungeons and make use of their available utility. With that said, if you learned something, please make sure to like and subscribe for more Warcraft content like it, and let's start off with the Theater of Pain. Right at the beginning, you'll find the Raging Bloodhorn, who has an ability called Raging Tantrum, which just deals AoE physical damage to your entire party, which you can actually soothe, as it is an enrage effect, to prevent it. On top of them, in this pack, there's also a couple unyielding contenders, which have another personal enrage effect called Death Wish, which increases their damage by 20%, but it actually also increases their damage taken by 20% as well, so I recommend not soothing this, but if your tank is having problems, you can soothe this also. The final guy in this pack is the Battlefield Ritualist, who casts Unholy Fervor, which is kickable, but if you do miss a kick, it will buff a random ally and healing them every time they attack, but you can actually Purge or even Spell Steal this as a mage to give yourself some healing. Moving on to the bosses here, all three bosses have something you want to focus on, with Desia the Decapitator having an enrage effect that will fixate a player, which again, you can just soothe off, and it also gets rid of the Absorb Shield. Sathel the Accursed will buff someone similar to the Unholy Fervor that we just mentioned, healing them whenever Sathel deals damage, which also can be purged or spell stolen if you have a mage. And Passerin the Virulent has Genetic Alteration, which is a disease on all allies which can be dispelled with anyone that has a disease dispel. Moving downwards into Zav's Wing, there are a couple mini-bosses in Dokig and Harugia that have the ability called Battle Trance, which again is kickable, but if you miss the kick, it'll give a shield and attack speed increase to them, which can be soothed off as it is an enrage effect. In the Abomination area, the Diseased Horrors have Decaying Blight, which is a stacking max health reduction on the tank, so you definitely want to disease dispel this when this starts getting to a few stacks. There's also Withering Blight from the Blighted Sludge Spewers, which is again kickable, and if you miss this kick, it is an AoE damage and healing reduction that can be disease dispelled, so if you miss that kick, make sure you are dispelling. In the Necromancer Wing, there's the Shadow Vulnerability from the Portal Guardians, which is just a 30% damage taken increase on a random player, which you want to curse dispel. And there's also the Bone Shields from the Bone Maguses, which are just a big absorb shield, which you can either purge off of them as soon as you meet them, or again, a mage can spell steal this for a nice little shield. Also in this wing are the Maniacal Soulbinders, which have Soul Corruption, which is a very, very hard-hitting magic dot that's put on a random player. So you want to make sure you are dispelling these. You can mass dispel this, of course, and on things like Cloak of Shadows for rogues, or Diffuse Magic for monks also work to get rid of this very scary dot. The last guy over here are the Nefarious Darkspeakers, which have Curse of Desolation, which puts a curse on a random player, and they just drop circles on the ground every few seconds that you'll want to avoid, otherwise they will fear you. Last up for the Theater of Pain is actually the boss in this wing, Koltharok, who puts the Phantasmal Parasite debuff on 2 players at a time, which is pulsing magic damage to them and nearby allies. And again, you can dispel or use other magic debuff droppers like I mentioned with Cloak and Diffuse to get rid of them, as they do hurt a lot. Moving on, we have Spires of Ascension. Now, this works a little bit like the Interrupts, where there's a bunch of mobs that work very, very similarly and have similarly typed abilities that you need to focus on. Starting with the Menders, Champions, and Wardens, they all have some sort of weapon buff that they will put on themselves. So either Imbue, Infuse, or Bless weapon. And if you purge or spell steal this, a weapon will shoot off from them and land on the ground that melee can pick up to get some bonus to their auto attacks. So make sure you're purging or spell stealing this if you can, and melee, if you see that weapon fall into the ground, make sure you walk over it to pick it up, as it will give you a little bit of a damage boost there. The other thing you have to worry about are actually the kickable abilities from the Castigators, Inquisitors, and Justicars in Burden of Knowledge, Internal Strife, and Forced Confession. So all 3 of these are kickable. All 3 of these will also put a magic debuff on someone, or sometimes multiple people, which if it goes off, you'll want to dispel ASAP, otherwise it's going to result in a dead player pretty quickly. The only other dispel in this dungeon rather is on the Ether Divers. Another kickable ability, but of course most groups won't be able to cover all these kicks, as they will just kind of spam cast Insidious Venom, which will stack up on your tank. And so you want to dispel this as soon as stacks get like 3, 4, 5-ish stacks. You want to dispel this just so they're not taking a bunch of ticking damage. That wraps up Spires, though. We move on to Sanguine, which there's not too much to worry about in here, actually. The first shows up after the first boss. So the Wicked Oppressors have a couple spells. Rack Soul, they'll spam this cast, so you won't be able to kick all of them most likely. And this is just a stacking magic dot on a random player. So you want to dispel these when you can before they get out of hand. And they'll also cast Curse of Suppression on a random player, which is again kickable, but again, you want to be kicking these guys a lot, so you won't necessarily have a kick up for all these, and that'll silence a random player with a curse effect. So if you have a curse dispel on someone else, you can get rid of that. Aside from that, there is Stone Skin on the Chamber Sentinel, which is a kickable 65% physical DR, but it can be purged or even spell stolen by a mage if you miss that kick or miss it on purpose for the mage. And then there's the Motivational Clubbing from the mini-boss Head Custodian Javelin. This grants 100% haste to one of the little guys, the Dirt Crunchers, and it can just be soothed off since it's an enrage effect. The last thing in Sanguine Depths is Explosive Anger from the Remnants of Fury, which is kickable. However, if it goes off, it'll give a 25% damage increase to the player before exploding after a few seconds. So you can kind of let this stay on the player for the damage increase and then curse dispel them before it actually detonates to take no damage. Moving on, we have Plaguefall, which has quite a few diseases. But first off, there's Wondergrow from the Fungal Mancers, which is a kickable AoE 15% damage increase to them and their allies. But this can be purged if you miss it, or if you miss it on purpose, you can have mages spell steal this. And I think you see some MDI strats actually where they let this just kind of chain cast and the mage just stacks up this buff. So if you have a mage, that is a nice little damage buff you can get there. And then moving on, there are slimes just before the first boss. The Gushing and Rotmare slimes both have this magic effect on them called Slime Coated. And basically, it's a magic buff on them that'll leave a puddle on death. So you can purge this off to not leave that puddle. But otherwise, it's just going to leave that big puddle on the ground, which you'll just have to avoid while it remains. Globgrog himself has Debilitating Plague, which is an AoE disease dot and slow, which again you can dispel. And if you're any of those extra classes that have disease dispel, like monks, that is a nice little spot where you can get an extra dispel off. And then you move on to the trash after Globgrog, where the Rotting Slime Claws and Plague Rocks both have stacking diseases that go on your tank, with Corroded Claws from the Slime Claws being a stacking 5% stat reduction, super scary, and Blightbeak from the Plague Rocks being a stacking 10% health reduction. So both of these are going to be very, very scary for your tank, and you're going to want to have a disease spell as often as possible, really, because you don't want these to stack very high at all. So if you're lacking a disease dispel, this can get very, very scary, and you might have to wait between packs to let their diseases fall off. In this area, there's also the Rigged Plague Borers, which have Wretched Phlegm, which is just a poison hit and slow that can be dispelled, as well as Gripping Infection from the Plague Binders, which is kickable, but if you miss it, it's a magic root and dot, so you can dispel that as well. There's also the Congealed Slimes, which have the Withering Filth ability they'll use on your tank to jump at them and debuff anyone nearby with a 45% haste reduction. Note that sometimes this looks like it's going to target someone else, but it always shoots at your tank, so just be aware of that purple circle. From there, we just have Dr. Ickis, which has a couple things. Slime Injection is a magic dot on your tank, which you'll want to dispel, as it will stack up if you leave it on them, and it just spawns a little ooze you have to step on. And Burning Strain, if your tank is not close to them, is just a spam cast that'll put a disease on a random player. So if your tank is not in melee for whatever reason, try and kick this. If this does go off, just try and disease dispel the player it goes on. Last up here, not last actually, the second last up here, we have Cytotoxic Slash from Demina Venomblade, which is a poison hit on the tank, so you can dispel that. And then finally, there is the Notorious Infectious Rain on Margaret Stradama, which deals a ton of party-wide damage and is a disease dot. So if you have a disease dispel, or maybe even a couple, if you have some DPS with a disease dispel, this is a great spot where you can actually heavily mitigate the party damage by dispelling this ability. From there, we have Necrotic Wake, where we start off with the Stitched Vanguards at the beginning of the dungeon. You have Seething Rage, which is a stacking 10% attack speed increase that they'll gain over time as they hit things, and basically you can just soothe this off multiple times to just reduce their attack speed. There's also these Olramus Gatekeepers, which I would 100% recommend skipping, just putting that out there, but if you do want to pull them, they have Clinging Darkness, which is a magic dot with a bunch of stacks that'll lose a stack every time it's dispelled. So you want to just kind of spam dispel this as much as you can to mitigate that damage. Blightbone himself has Heaving Wretch, which is a cone that puts a disease dot on any one hit. And you can just dispel that, and ideally you have just the one person kind of baited away and everyone else avoids it. If you end up cleaving a few people, it hurts a lot, so definitely not ideal there. The mini-boss Narzuda has Dark Shroud, which gives him physical damage immunity and is pulsing AoE damage as well, which you can dispel, or again with a mage, Spell Steal. There's quite a few spell stealable abilities as you might have noticed, so having a mage is actually quite beneficial. Moving on, there's Amarth with Unholy Frenzy, another enrage effect, which is just an attack speed increase, so you can soothe that. And then you move up into the Necropolis, where the corpse collectors in there have Gore Splatter, which is a kickable effect, but if you miss that kick, it will put an AoE disease on everyone. Definitely don't recommend missing that kick, because it's very painful, especially on fortified weeks, but if you do miss it, you can disease dispel at least a couple people. Then we have the last boss, Nalthor, which has Frozen Binds on a random player, which is just a magic root that'll spread to anyone within 16 yards when you dispel it, so you'll want to just make sure everyone runs out and then you dispel it. From there, we have Mists of Tirna Scythe, where there are a couple things to worry about, beginning with the Spite Claws, which are those first things you attack if you have the Night Phase skip, and they do have a magic buff on them that will curse all enemies on death. So if you have some kind of AoE purge, like Mass Dispel, Shamans can just single target purge, Hunters single target purge as much as you can. Blood Elf, Arcane Torrent does work here as well, because that'll give you a big damage amp on you when they explode and die, so it can be very deadly. So you want to make sure you're trying to get rid of those if you can. From there's not really much until you get to the maze, where you have the Mistfield Defenders, which will get a 50% damage increase on ally death, which you can soothe off of them. The Mistfield Shapers have the Bramblethorn Coat, which is kickable, as do the Mistfield Tenders, who have Nourish the Forest, again kickable, and both of these can be purged or spell stolen if you miss that kick as well. Then there's Anima Injection from the Mistfield Stingers, which is a poison on a random player that explodes on expiration, so you'll want to make sure you dispel this. You can actually also do things like if it targets a ranged member, if you use things like Ursul's or Binding, they will dash out to the ranged member and not be able to reach them, so it'll kind of pseudo-interrupt it. But otherwise, that's really the only way to prevent that from going off. So otherwise, you need a poison dispel. Also in the maze is the Mistveil Night Blossom, the mini-boss, which has Triple Bite on your tank, which will put a poison dot on them that you can dispel. And then you just have a couple bugs in the Spine Maw Staghorn and Spine Maw Reaver, where the Staghorn has the Stimulate Resistance, which puts the AoE shield on all of the nearby bugs. It is kickable, it is purgeable and spell stealable if you miss the kick. The Reavers have Debilitating Poison, which, as you can guess, is a poison debuff that does stack up on your party members, and it does deal a fairly significant amount of damage, so you want to dispel this as soon as possible if you can. Then we have Halls of Atonement, where there's actually, not too much. It's probably the least amount of stuff you have to worry about in this dungeon. First off is Loyal Beasts. We talked about this in the kick video again, but it's on the Depraved Houndmasters. It is stunnable or other kinds of CC to prevent the kick, but if it does go off, there is an enrage effect on the Gorgons, or the Gargons rather, which you can soothe off. And you will want to soothe off, or your tank will be murdered very soon. There's also Curse of Obliteration, another kickable spell from the Obliterators, and it's just a curse that does AoE damage once it detonates, so you want to curse dispel that if you miss the kick. Stony Veins is from the Stoneborn Eviscerators and Reavers. This is a stacking magic debuff on the tank, which will instant kill them at 10 stacks, so you want to be consistently dispelling this if you're ever pulling those guys. We normally never pull these guys. We Invispot / Shroud skip this stuff, but if you are pulling them, just be aware of that magic debuff. Last up is the second boss, Echelon. He puts a curse on all 5 party members that stuns them after a few seconds. and of course he has the jump in that phase as well. And you can actually curse dispel this when it goes out. And so what we do, we have, depending on the group, 1 or 2 curse dispels. And so if we have 2 curse dispels, we have one person always dispel the healer, and then we have another person always dispel the targeted person, as it is possible for them to actually dodge the impact damage as well. So that's a handy little trick for Echelon. Last up, we have the other side, where there's a few effects you want to focus on, starting with the Undying Rage from the Risen Warlords. This is a 100% damage increase to them, as well as death immunity while active, so you will want to soothe these as soon as possible, just to help your tank out. The Death Speakers in this outer ring also have Death's Embrace, which is a kickable haste buff, but if you have a mage in your group, you can spell steal this when it goes off, so I definitely recommend not kicking if you have a mage. Or if you miss the kick, you can also purge it off if you have one of those purgeable classes. The Raptors in this outer ring also are painful for your tank, as they'll stack up Decrepit Bite on them, which is just a stacking disease dot, so you want to disease dispel this, or just kind of kite to drop stacks if you need to. And then we move into Hakar's Wing. There's just one thing you need to worry about here, and that's the Deathwalkers. When they die, they have their spirit, and this spirit can be purged, and it'll just cause them to instantly die instead of fixate for the 15-second duration. I don't recommend spell stealing this, as it will kill you, just a note, but you can if you really want to. Moving on to Ardenweald, we have the Wailed Shimmer Moths, which have the Soporific Shimmer Dust ability. It will put a curse on you that forces you to jump or be put to sleep, and so you can curse dispel this if you want to, but really it's not too hard for melee DPS in particular to deal with if they just kind of jump every few seconds to prevent the debuff from stacking up on them. Last up is just the Bladebeak Matriarch, which will both self-enrage, which you can dispel, but it'll also cast Angering Shriek, which will enrage all nearby Bladebeak Cranes. So this is really normally too many for you to soothe. I definitely recommend just starting to begin your kite as soon as that happens, and just kiting those extra cranes until that enrage effect ends. You won't be able to kite the Matriarch itself because it's immune to those kinds of CCs, but everything else you can just keep away from your tank so that they can actually live. But that does conclude this video, guys. If you found it useful, remember, like and subscribe to support the channel. It really does help. Soon I'll be putting out a similar video covering things like tank busters, frontal cones, and bleed effects, so be on the lookout for that. I'm also working on a series where I pug my way to KSM as the lowest represented tank, Protection Warrior, which you can check out live on my Twitch at Tactics if you're interested. That's all for now, though. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.